Hello, everyone. Welcome to the AA Yonsei lecture series, The Ambivalence of Design. My name is James Kwang-ho Chung, and I'm one of the co-organizers and moderators of this lecture series. Before we start, Brendan, June, Jaewon, and I would like to thank all the speakers who were very generous with their time in preparing the lectures. Also, we thank our A visiting school program, a public program, AV department, and Yonsei's Learner Studio, who helped us in with initiating, organizing, and executing the event. This lecture series is funded by the British Council UK-Korea Virtual Academic Collaboration Grant. Brendan Carlin and I have been working very closely with Jun Sung and Jaewon Lee from Yonsei University since last winter when we were preparing for the grant application. Four of us all teach at the so-called design studio in London and Seoul. Our initial conversation started with what are we designing and what for, and came to suspicion, are we making too many assumptions with our current understanding of the term design? This led us to collectively rethink our current and potential alternative forms of design practice together with 9 invited speakers. We'll give a brief introduction of all speakers after Brandon's explanations on the conceptual thinking and theories behind the lecture series.
Hello, everyone. Just to give a brief intro to what we developed for a brief and kind of pitch to the speakers that are going to be speaking over the 9 lectures. Initially, we kind of conceptually we threw around this idea of design versus architecture, and actually, I think initially the question or the thought was to call the series anti-design. However, in the end, we decided to call it the ambivalence of design, because I think we've become acutely aware over years of our own research and practice that every theoretical concept that gives power and direction to architectural practice kind of walks a fine line, where on one side, it can kind of keep us trapped in the current direction that we're going and in a kind of crisis. And on the other side, it might lead to a more liberated or kind of emancipatory potentials. So the series is, I would say, is particularly interested in the subjectivity of the architect and the modes of theory and practice in architecture. And I think we argue that because of or despite or because of the fact that the architect is so often a kind of optimist and idealist, ethically concerned, and we're very much concerned with, for instance, making the city a kind of fresh and beautiful image. Yet on the other hand, we're always subject to the validation and of the market and survival by patrons, etc. So we think that this kind of coupling, this marriage of things, actually is kind of leading to the cloaking and blinding and binding of the city into a perpetual and deepening state of crisis that we find ourselves in today. So ultimately, of course, I think in our studio and in the series, we want to start to probe ways that we can find a way out of this trap in crisis. And we would say out of kind of pandemics of homogeneity in the city, dullness, boringness of the city, as Heatherwick said recently. We probably disagree with the way he wants to get out of that. We want to find a way out of these pandemics of overwork, anxiety, depression, and that we think that this means that we have to go to the roots of how the city is being imagined, designed, and produced today, and therefore the roots of how we think, design, and build as architects. Therefore, the invitation and brief for the series for the workshop with Yonsei that we're doing between our groups of students and for the speakers really revolved around 2 questions. The first question is how, as architects, we might expose and suspend kind of habits or automatisms of our design practice that we inherit without critically questioning them. So again, while we're often have the best of intentions, we end up lending an image to the city and prolonging our crisis in a sense. And the second question is how, as architects, we can develop alternative forms of praxis and architectures that might empower ourselves and others to break from what we call a kind of economy of crisis, and instead start to become ourselves and help others become, in a sense, world builders. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we'll briefly introduce our invited lecturers, and more detailed information about the lecture description and the speakers can be found both on the AA Public Program website and Yonsei's Architecture Department website. So let me briefly introduce the invited lecturers who will be joining us at the AA campus in London. Andrea Branzi of Archizoom will share his work from the Milan Triennale exhibition in the form of prose. Olivia Mara, who teaches at the AA, Central St. Martin's, and the Bartlett, will talk about gardening as a ritual of individual self-care and collective imagination. Francesca Romana Dell'Alio, who teaches at the AA, Cambridge, and the RCA, will expose architecture to the act of transgression as an act of design. Federico Campagna, a philosopher based in London and the author of Prophetic Culture, The Last Night, and Technique and Magic, will look at the interactions between metaphysics and architecture. David Wengrow, the author of What Makes Civilization, The Origins of Monsters, and international bestseller, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, co-authored with David Graeber, will question the definition of urbanization for the final event of the lecture series. And Jun and Jaewon will continue with the invited speakers who will be joining us at the Yonsei campus in Seoul.
In Seoul, we are going to have three lectures. First one is HYUNGMIN Pai, is architectural historian, curator, professor in University of Seoul, and he's going to give a lecture on practicing change. It's also theoretical account of a transformational trajectory, in particular for Korean setting. The second lecture will be on 11th of October by Taeyeon Kim and Hyunjin Kim and Oni community. And they are giving a lecture about Oni community housing designed and built between 2015 and 2016. The third one is Jung-Wan Jo. He is literary critics and political philosophers and the representative of Galmuri publishers. In this lecture, Jo Jung-Hwan will talk about the complex reality that in the transition of modern capitalism from industrial capitalism to cognitive capitalism, the networked metropolis beyond the world factory has emerged as expanded geographical spaces for the productions. And the productive subjective is being reconstructive from the unified industry workers to multitude home artists. So we are going to give us three different lectures in Korea in different times. And June is going to present our...
Hi everyone, I'm Jun. As a co-host, I think it's worth mentioning that this whole event is funded by the British Council. So actually last year, between an AA and Yonsei, we applied for exploratory grant for virtual collaboration between UK and Korea. And when we applied with the relay learning concept, it was well accepted, and we got that's how all this event has started. So I would like to welcome everyone from Yonsei and from University of Seoul as well, and from all other publics, and from there, good morning there, London, from AA. And this is very exciting moment because for us, this is the very first our experiment as a sort of two-way broadcasting system that AA Learner Studio has done. So even if there are some mistakes, I think hopefully we can all understand as an exploration. And hopefully you can keep your interest into our series of the lecture and then keep it up. And what I want to say is this lecture is only part of our work. And between an AA and Yonsei studio, we are sharing our studio brief, and the students will work throughout the whole semester. And we are working under the theme of the crisis and therapy that we will continue working, and with the contents of the lectures that we are going to have, we will publish planning, hopefully, by the end of this year. So keep your interest to our work and let's get it started. Yeah, should I introduce our first lecturer? Shall we just start now? Okay. As Jaewon introduced, our very first lecturer is HYUNGMIN Pai. He's a professor from University of Seoul. He's an architectural historian. So I will pass my microphone over to HYUNGMIN. Please welcome HYUNGMIN.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to become this guinea pig for, I think, a post-COVID media environment. And also, thank you for inviting me, despite the fact that I have never considered myself a designer or an architect, but that you are dealing with a critical issue about, I guess, the crisis of design, or the stage where we do have to think about changing the basic paradigm of design. And so I thought that this would be an opportunity for me to talk about my own transformations. And so even though I am not a designer or an architect, I have gone through different phases of work, of types of work, and I do very different kinds of things. And my own personal transformation, I think, tells a story about larger transformations in Korean society and in the global world. And so the idea about how design can change, and I think it's there's no need to explain why at this moment that we do have to change. And change is very difficult. It's at a personal level, at a societal level. So how does one change? And so I thought I would address that question through my own personal experience. The fancy term these days would be auto-theoretical account of transformations. And so I will begin my talk. Can you put the PowerPoint up, please? Okay, thank you. So I set up the title as Practicing Change, in the way that how change has occurred through my own experiences and through my own sort of transformations of kinds of practices. And of course, there's the component of knowledge and how one goes through the different phases of practice, maneuvering through conditions of ignorance, particularly in the Korean condition. So I begin my talk with a kind of little photographic memory lane. And so, of course, this divulges my age, which is, I guess, okay. But I think as I went through my sort of different adolescence to adulthood to what I'm doing now, obviously Korean society changed together with me. And so this little red graph that sort of crosses my different images is a graph of the growth of GDP per capita. So this is a very surprising, it's a startling, an amazing sort of transformation of Korean society. And of course, a graph that goes up is better than a graph that goes down, probably. But of course, we all know that this GDP going up doesn't mean that everybody is better off. That you could put up a graph of the rate of suicide in Korea, and it will probably follow this up. And we are now the most suicidal society among advanced countries. So this kind of sort of condensed rhythm of change sort of creates a kind of experience that I think very few societies have had. And so you go through different kinds of experiences. And for me, when I was a young boy, actually this is probably the highlight of my life. actually I had grown up in different countries overseas, and then I came back to Korea and went through a primary school. And during these years, I'm not sure whether amongst you anybody is old enough to remember, we had to memorize what we called the 국민교육헌장, or in English, Charter of National Education. And the first sentence goes, translated, "We were born to this land with the historical mission of the rejuvenation of our people." Now, this is heavy stuff, like for a little kid and you had to memorize this. In the morning, everybody sort of resuscitated this. And this is a kind of textbook and an image of the development of Korea and of Seoul. That building, designed by a famous Korean architect, Kim Jung-ho, was a kind of symbol of progress and development and modernization that Korea at this time was pursuing with great fervor and with a lot of violence. And so this kind of idea that we were born with a kind of historical destiny, and that it was related to nation, to development, and to our people. Of course, this is a typically Hegelian idea. And of course, after passing the highlight of my life, I quickly entered middle school and had to cut my hair off like in military style and wear this military style uniform. And so this was a legacy, a remnant of Japanese dictatorial military culture. And so I went through, I think, this period. And though, of course, you become critical of this, and when I went to college and university, I was with kids going out and demonstrating against the military regime. But at the same time, when I look back, I was actually quite sort of inundated with this Hegelian idea. So I did believe that my mission was to rejuvenate Korea and its people. So you are usually not free from the kind of spirit of the age, to use a Hegelian term. And at that sort of time, of course, I was a young boy, and so I wouldn't have known that actually during this time, some significant cultural and architectural moments were being created. And so 1971, when I was in 5th grade, the Space Group building and his Pompidou Center competition proposal was built, and it was for Kim Soo-geun a kind of transformational moment where at once he was sort of like working as the architect of the nation, and then through different sort of incidents, he would turn towards a kind of more personal, but also having this kind of idea of a Korean aesthetic. And so as you sort of go through life, actually there are things that are going around you that are quite important, and maybe you connect to that at a later age. But I've always sort of looked back in life and understood that I didn't know anything that was going on. I thought I was, I knew what was happening, but actually not so. So by the time I go to architecture school, and most of you are here, having gone through architectural school or are now in school, it was a very specific period in Korea, and it was still under military dictatorship. A new military government had taken power, and the university was barely open. There was always some kind of curfew going on, but in the few times that I actually attended school, where the professor actually showed up, they would sort of assume that they were teaching architectural design. And so in 1980, I was still using these drafting tools that were used in the 13th century. So I was using basically medieval tools even until the 1980s. So at that moment, of course, I was a young, very energetic student that was anticipating a lot of things from architecture schools. And the first thing that they taught in design studio is how to draw lines with these traditional drafting tools that Alberti used. And they would teach you how to draw the thickness of lines. And so the first thing you do when you go to architecture school is you sort of put these white drawing paper on your drafting table, and you would sort of practice drawing these lines. And so, of course, I thought, okay, this is what architects do. and after a while, though, the question came up, why am I doing this? Why is drawing different thickness of lines important? And not the professor, the TA, the professor showed up like once a semester or so. So I would ask my TA, why do we have to differentiate the thickness of lines? And the answer was, shut up and just do it. Don't ask these sort of like stupid questions and just do as you are told. So this is, of course, this military culture. And so it was very tough. I thought architecture was fun, but during school it didn't turn out to be that way. So you could say that I was in a civilizational transitional period. So I was using tools that were used by Alberti, but already by that time, of course, computerization of design and practice was already going on. But of course, I was oblivious. Most of the people during the 1980s, even the 1980s, were oblivious to what would become a very fundamental transformation of society and of architecture. So 20 years ago already, AutoCAD was being developed at MIT, and in the late 1970s, 80s, AutoCAD was being first sort of experimentally used even in Korean offices. So again, you don't know what's going on, You think probably this generation with all the great information the internet gives you, maybe you think you know what's going to happen. But I think, it's basically you go through different conditions of ignorance. And so to confess, at that point, during these exercises, I very quickly understood or thought that I would not become an architect. And that's why I'm here right now, actually. And the three reasons that I thought I couldn't become an architect was that one was that I couldn't do all-nighters. Just 24 hours without sleep and I was just gone. And so, but my friends, they would 48, 72 hours and they didn't even blink. And so I thought, I didn't have the stamina to become an architect. Nowadays, I understand that actually doing all-nighters is not doing architecture the right way, I think. And the second reason was that my friends somehow were able to do the projects, sort of draw the plan and then draw the sections and elevations without receiving any kind of education, nobody really taught you anything. And so I was, I had from my own sort of I guess it's a kind of personality trait, I had to understand these things, sort of somebody had to explain to me how you go from a plan to a section to elevation, why does this sort of window has to be like this. And so I thought I'm too much of a thinker to become an architect. I think that's also was not right. And then the third most absurd reason was that I had sweaty palms. And so when I drafted, the tracing paper would all become sort of like, and I thought, okay, so because of my sweaty palms, I couldn't become an architect. And I didn't know that the computer would come and you really didn't need to deal with paper. And so, this is a really comical sort of scene of a young adult sort of thinking through one's future. And so things changed, obviously. And because of this sort of search for, how do I do architecture? It seemed interesting. And so in graduate school, I went to study urbanism. And I thought that maybe city planning or urban design would teach me how to, but of course that didn't happen. But then during that graduate school, I met somebody who had gone through a history theory program at MIT. And I thought that was really cool, and that this sort of thinking person in me would enjoy kind of historical, theoretical education. So I ended up doing my Ph.D. at MIT. And during this time, I think there was sort of two key moments that sort of helped me, sort of guided me through my interests. And one is in the fall of 1986, there was a seminar on Louis Kahn. And we studied Louis Kahn's education. And he went through a Beaux-Arts training. And as I studied that, I first understood at that moment that actually architecture could actually be taught, that there was a system of knowledge and practices that could be taught and learned. And also, the Beaux-Arts system teaches you why you have to differentiate thickness of lines, what the difference of thickness of lines means, how to read it, how to use it. And so that was sort of like a revelation. Like now I understood why I had to do these line training, why dessin and why you shade things. And so that there was a kind of what now is very important, continues to be important to me, is discipline. That there's an architectural discipline, there's a historical reason why the discipline was formed that way, society's requirements for architecture and how architecture responds. So the idea that there is a discipline, that discipline is important, that it changes in a historical fashion, was understood, and that became sort of like my primary area of study, and then it went on, continued on to my dissertation. Another important thinker was Michel Foucault. I never met the person. I think he passed away in '84, but intellectually he continues to be, I think, my primary sort of go-to thinker. And of course, he was the antidote to my Hegelian upbringing. And so as a theoretical position, I could understand how one could sort of maneuver through a Hegelian condition and move on to different things. Of course, you grow up, and I had, but so while I was sort of like just happily being a international student in the United States, serious transformations were going on in Korea. So right here in this campus, we all know about the major events of 1986 and 87 of the Olympics and its impact on Korean society in general, the process of democratization and the opening up of Korean society so it was actually slowly going away from this Hegelian mode and so the transformations of Korean society and my sort of learning of the architectural discipline. So my dissertation topic was on the Beaux-Arts and its transformation, how the architectural discipline in the particularly in America, changes from the 19th century to the 20th century. And so after the dissertation, my MIT Press book came out, and then it was translated into Korean. So discipline became sort of my primary idea, that you could understand, teach, and learn, and that it was, the key is, of course, that it is a historical phenomena, and that discipline does change. It has changed, and it will, of course, change. But one of the things that after I came back, and of course this coming back is also a very sort of like a Hegelian move to me. Like, I never assumed that I would I would take a job outside of Korea. Sort of, I had this idea that I would return to Korea and rejuvenate our people, or rejuvenate Korean architecture, or whatever kind of fantasy that I might have had. But it was sort of, I think, internalized. But what was sort of like obvious when I came back was that there was a societal need for critical discourse. And so I had expected that, but when I actually came and Korean Architectural Society sort of asked me to become this critic, to become intellectual of Korean architecture, was understandable, but for the longest time, I couldn't respond to that. Primarily because Korean architecture, obviously, has a different history from the West. And my sort of intellectual training, my understanding of history, my historical methods were developed based on Western traditions, Louis Kahn, Michel Foucault, Le Corbusier, and so my training, my discipline as a historian was very, very fundamentally Western. But of course, the topic itself was a kind of Korean, my own sort of personal interest and my own sort of struggles to find how to do architecture. And so, for example, the facade. So there's a long tradition of how one creates the facade or the elevation of a building, but this tradition doesn't exist in Korea. So the way you create spaces and who creates them is a totally different condition. And so when I was asked to write about contemporary Korean architecture, I was put in a very, very difficult situation. I had to read. This is a building by Seung Yo-sang around early 2000, a Welcome City. And how do you read a building like this, a facade? How do you write about it? How do you think about it? And of course, you relate it to Seung's teacher, Kim Soo-gun. That building was 1971. So, but this book actually was very important in that sense, that through this book, I was able to start writing about Korean architecture. And so the way I did it was that you don't throw away all you have learned, obviously, that's what you have. But you assume that this doesn't actually apply to Korean architecture directly. But the way you do it is you start questioning Korean architecture through the phenomena of the West. And so the question was, what is this wall? What is this facade? And through these questionings, you understand. So for me, through this book, one of the key sort of conclusions was that these walls, actually, this facade, is not actually a wall or facade, but a kind of fence. And that this vertical surface that has a kind of different kind of role. And so you go through sort of the experiences, the drawings, the phenomena, and then you arrive at certain very different kinds of concepts. So for Seung's architecture, I was able to sort of devise this idea of the house of postures, of the expressive floor, and so that the floor becomes much more important than Western architecture. And so, I won't go into this too much, but for example, in the Western tradition, the plane going onto the floor was such a very radical move. But in the Korean tradition, in Korean convention, more accurately, the floor is a very, very comfortable sort of intimate relation with the occupant. And so these kinds of ideas or concepts are invented through a kind of questioning. And so, for example, a more recent work by Mr. Seung shows you. So even as I went through this sort of experience of again, it's an experience of ignorance. You don't know how to deal with this, but you create a kind of process where you invent certain ideas or terms. And so I understood that writing about Korean contemporary or modern architecture is a kind of invention of history, so that by writing about the present, one creates a past. And the idea that indeed history changes, that history is created by the present was very, very palpable as I went through this writing. And so from this moment, I thought, I now consider myself a critic. Now I can write about Korean architecture. And so from a young aspiring architecture student, but I never became an architect. And then through my training at MIT, I became a kind of historian. And then now I could say that I was a critic. So these sort of shifting experiences created different modes of practice, even as of course, an intellectual and as a writer. And again, of course, things change in Korea and also around the world. Now, sort of like there's a big shift in interest in the cultural world. And now, even in the West, the claim that they will move away from a Eurocentric sort of vision of the world. And so these kinds of, there was, of course, postmodernism, and then the idea of an interest in global architecture, in global history, in the global contemporary. And, but my attitude towards this phenomenon is very critical. I think this is not the right way to go about doing a global practice. Actually, an interchange of in a network of things. So for me, the kind of worst kind of example of a kind of Western-centered globalization is Ken Frampton's modern architecture. It began in like 1980, and it's sort of like the longest-running textbook on modern architecture. And so I think he became so famous that like worldwide, South Korea wanted Ken to come by and just write about Korean architecture, and that would be such a honor or something. But if his writing about Lebanon or Iraq is at the level of South Korea, I think this is really, this is. And I wrote about this. I was very direct about this in an article in Architectural Review. And so as the world changes, when the sort of Eurocentric idea, the Western-centric idea of the world actually doesn't work, and of course you have there's this idea that you have to expand, you have to change your position. That is extremely difficult from the Eurocentric point of view. The difficulties from the more so-called local position, I've lived through that. And so I think the way, and this symposium itself, I think, is a challenge on how we sort of create international conditions, global conditions. But then at this time, so when I started mingling with architects, when I became a critic, you sort of like, become friends, you talk with architects. And so mingling with the architectural community, opportunities for curatorial work arise. And so, for example, in 2008, I created the Korean Pavilion together with Yonsei professor, Choi Moon-gyu. So that was quite fun, actually. Choi Moon-gyu and I have become great friends after this. And then I would also be involved in large biennales. So I gradually became more sort of involved in exhibitions and curatorial practice. So at the beginning, I would sort of I would be the writer for the exhibition. Like I would just sort of like write a text, introductory text in the catalog. And then I started sort of becoming more and more directly involved in the exhibition work, as becoming a curator. And so my career as a sort of curator, the important moment was 2014. It was my second opportunity as the curator for the Korean Pavilion. And Jo Min-seok, a Yonsei alumni, was the commissioner. At that time, they called him the commissioner. So Jo Min-seok and I sort of were the key members of curating this thing. And Rem Koolhaas was the overall artistic director for Venice. And you may know that we won the big prize. So we won the Golden Lion for the best national participation. And what was important at that moment for me was, of course, I was more involved as the intellectual sort of agent. So I edited the book. I contributed to the curatorial process. But what I found out through this process was that there was a kind of interaction between textual practice and visual and spatial practice. And so I don't think I have time to go through this sort of the process of this 2014 moment. But I came to sort of like a methodology of architectural creating. So what is different from maybe an art exhibition? What are the possibilities and limitations of an architectural exhibition? And how does the different components of graphics, textual practice, of spatial design, how do they sort of interact to create a kind of curatorial experience? And the key here was that I personally didn't know anything about North Korean architecture. So I had never visited Pyongyang, so it's one of my bucket list. So before I sort of go away, I want to visit Pyongyang. So I was this sort of curator of the first exhibition on North Korean and South Korean architecture without having ever, we tried. It was, we tried and at some point we thought we were going to go to Pyongyang. But the idea, the issue was that how would I be able to create an exhibition of something that I barely know about? So again, the condition of ignorance. Again, you're doing something that you really don't know, but you have to sort of create knowledge out of that. You have to do something. You have to be able to design something that has effect and meaning. And so my experience was that through this sort of curatorial process, this interaction between text and image and space, you could do something that maybe was impossible as an academic endeavor. If somebody asked me to write a book about North Korean architecture, I would say, no, I have no expertise in doing that. I wouldn't do that. Maybe somebody who studied that, maybe you should not. But as an exhibition, I understood that I could actually do it. That curatorial practice allowed you to maneuver go through ignorance and create something that had impact, that had effect, that was that had power, that had agency. And so, but that didn't mean, of course, that I became a sudden expert on North Korea. I still say I don't know that much about North Korean architecture. And so, so rather than displays of positive knowledge, this was my sort of essay, Curatorial Confessions of a Crow. The idea that we were a one-eyed crow was the basic idea from the very beginning, that we were entering this without knowledge, and that this curatorial experience would nonetheless be able to make something. So after this prize, I became known as a curator, then a scholar. Nobody really took interest in my scholarly work, like barely. Maybe if I wrote a paper, maybe 10 people actually would read it. But sort of like I was sort of now considered a curator, and then more opportunities to do exhibitions came. And so I'm just showing a few recent work that I did as a curator. 2020, and then again a major biennale, this time as the first inaugural director for the Seoul Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism. Again, a very challenging topic, a topic that I had not direct expertise in. So this is an exhibition on urbanism, on the city, on the phenomena of the commons, of climate change. And so again, we are dealing with very serious and encompassing themes that I would not say that I'm an expert on. But at the same time, the topics are very, very important. They are the questions of the age. And so how do you transform from somebody who had this sort of very traditional architectural interest in discipline, in how architects design buildings in the 19th century, how that changed in the 20th century, how do architects sort of think through in different cultural settings. But then we all realize that we are in a moment of crisis. This is not just an architectural crisis, but of society in general and of Earth itself. And so you realize that you do have to deal with this, but I never grew up or was trained in dealing with issues of climate change. So how do you sort of approach this? How do you change as you practice? And so again, I think curatorial practice has guided me through this condition. And so again, as with smaller exhibitions, these larger exhibitions also creates collaborative conditions. And that's how you sort of learn. You learn from your partners, your curators, your architects who participate. And that's sort of like a process through which you start sort of engaging in the issues, contemporary issues that have emerged after your actual sort of intense training. And so, we sort of arrive at the present. So the last image is taken from last year's sort of curatorial work that I did with, again, Seoul Museum of Art. And sort of continuing the kind of interest in large-scale urban and climate issues. So I created an exhibition called Climate Museum, And the introductory image that I used for this lecture was part of this exhibition. And it was part of the kind of graphic system that we used for the exhibition, because we were earnest in designing and setting up the museum with the lowest carbon emission possible. And so we vowed that we would not make any kind of waste through this exhibition, that there would be no throwing away of things. And so for the graphic, we would reuse a Xerox paper. And so even the printing of that was a kind of ecological typography. And so for that, I think, experimental sort of approach to the design of the exhibition, to the content of it, we were acknowledged by the Red Dot Design Award and for the overall sort of design approach to the exhibition. So this is a moment where we are discussing the sort of graphic system with the graphic designer, a wonderful, talented young designer called Hong Baksa. And so again, this is a kind of collaborative moment where you can do new things, try new things. And this exhibition was part of a kind of larger project by my colleague, Professor Lee Hae-won at Daejeon University, and she was heading this major project called Climate Citizen 3.5. And so I've now sort of like gradually become a kind of climate sort of engager. I am not an expert. Again, I do not profess to be an expert. It is such a wide-ranging issue, but I do sort of more traditional research. So my take on my role, I think, as someone who had always been interested in materiality of networks of material and information. Again, that's a kind of Foucaultian sort of inspiration. And so my sort of like specialization as a traditional academic has been on the material aspects of climate change, or of the material aspects of modernity, and how we practice change towards a kind of different kind of material civilization. And so this was a kind of research project within Climate Citizen 3.5 and the Climate Museum exhibition, where we were analyzing the material sort of formation of different typologies of housing in Korea from the 1950s to the main sort of concrete construction of the apartments that dominate the Korean landscape. And then lastly, sort of the high-rise steel-framed buildings and how the different kind of material conditions created these kinds of types of houses. And so you do different things. You do scholarly research. You create like video images through that. And so I have a website platform which I use to continue sort of putting on sort of the research and curatorial work, and it's called assemblage.house, and I don't think I have time to show that, so we'll go on. So this is actually a moving image, analytical moving image of how a typical post-1980s apartment block would be built. The work, I'll end this talk with the work that I'm now doing. I've recently been appointed the artistic director of the 5th edition of the Gwangju Folly. And so again, you know, the first sort of reaction when I was offered the job was, you know, don't build things that are not necessary. But the idea of the folly, which is of course an 18th century sort of idea from Western landscaping tradition, or in the Korean tradition, it is sort of like the 정자 in the Korean garden. So the idea was that follies are useless. They don't have a program. And so I had to sort of rethink what a folly should be in this age of climate change. And so the idea that I'm moving with, and we're going through the early stages of planning the folly, is that we will build all the follies through a circular economy system. And so all the folly will be based on sustainable materials. In this case, it would be the Korean architect Jo Nam-ho, and not by coincidence, he won a public art project this summer, and based on the system that he will use for the folly. And so this is will be developed into a mobile system where you can disassemble and reassemble these pieces depending on the programmatic needs of the scheduling. And so these follies can be reused. In this case, it's a kind of reusable system. Another project that is ongoing is building a house all through reused materials, recycled materials. And we have Assemble Studio from London and BC Architects from Brussels and Atelier Luma from Arles, working together with regional research institutes and biocompetence and craft in sort of bringing their expertise in recyclable materials, architectural materials, and we will have a building that is totally sort of based on recycled material. So this is, for example, the left is what's the word? So in this case, it's acoustic panels using straws, and of course, southern France and the Jeollado area have this common sort of rice farming tradition, and this panel is made out of sunflower seeds, and so we will sort of work together to develop different kinds of materials. We will collaborate with craft workshops, and of course craft extremely expensive, but at the same time based on sustainable materiality. And so we will do experiments to try and modernize craft materials and sort of find a new way of industrializing the Korean craft tradition. And so our lofty idea is that we will perhaps begin the Bauhaus of Korea, where the shift from craft to industry occurred in Europe 100 years ago. Perhaps we can create a new kind of process where Korean crafts enters a new kind of post-industrial, recyclable, circular economy. Beautiful. Earth architecture, the possibilities of earth architecture. Actually, I saw Pare on the screen. I don't know whether they're actually in, but another project that's ongoing is circular economy mobility. And so I'm working with Pare. They had done a project, a robot going around Seunsangae and Ulchiro area for the neighborhood recycling system when I was the director of the Seoul Biennale. And since then, they've done many, many interesting things, and we will sort of revisit that issue and have robots and mobility units sort of working within Gwangju as a mobile system for the circular economy. So I finished with a few images of last year's exhibition. I think the idea that one goes through transformations, through change, through maneuvering through conditions of ignorance. I think we are actually quite good at that. we've gone through different phases of transformation, Korean society itself. And one of my most interesting sort of interviews of older architects who went through the early stages of modernization was that this was an interview with Mr. Kim Seok-chul, who passed away. And he was working with Kim Soo-gun, and Kim Soo-gun was at the time sort of like doing national projects. And so the idea was that to design an airport, the first sort of like actually private airport in Korea. And he said at the time he had never taken an airplane flight. He hadn't even seen an airplane. He didn't know what an airplane was. But then he was sort of like the project manager for designing the major airport for Korea. And so I thought, okay, I think I understand what's going on here. And I'm going through actually the same kind of process, though the issues are different. I think airports and modernization, building things without knowing what they are, from the idea that now we've gone through a kind of very condensed modernization and period of modernity, and now we have to also, as part of this very fundamental global change challenge, to go through climate change and somehow survive through that, go through the issues of inequality in Korean society and survive through that. And so the process of going through conditions of ignorance, I think it differs from, I think personally. So my sense is that this idea of practicing change, and it is a kind of practice. You don't really actually know whether it's the real thing. You go through it, and there is no real theoretical sort of structure to help you, actually. There's no kind of positive knowledge. And in the issue of climate change and this kind of curatorial practice, there's no real argument, theoretical, deep, intricate theoretical argument about how to do it. It's actually doing the thing. And in a lot of cases, it's something quite new. And so through that practice, through that experience, you sort of get new ideas. You create new concepts. The idea of what a exhibition graphic can be, how it's communicated, I think was a very significant experience. You could even call it a kind of theoretical take on information design. But it was fun, it was challenging, and there was this process through which something was created, and then of course with exhibitions you take it down and then you end up with again an empty space. And so I think this sort of process of practice is almost atheoretical, but at the same time going through that practice, it creates new ideas and new ways of talking about it. And so I still think that I'm a historian and a critic and someone who creates intellectual discourse, but the process in which we are able to think about new things, do new things, has been a very different kind of trajectory. And I hope that this somehow sort of helps you in your own future road through different times. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we don't have a specific microphone outside here, but I hope you can hear well inside. Thank you for the amazing lecture. And if there's any comments or questions, we can now maybe start from the studio.
Hi, thank you so much for the lecture. It was really wonderful to see such an expose of your work. And I think, of course, the students will have questions. I just thought to warm up a little bit the panel because the Q&A format is always a bit daunting for students. But just to ask you, I thought it was really curious to hear how the figure of the curator has been a little bit more productive for you. It's allowed you to question things that are outside of your expertise. And I wanted to kind of reflect on the role of the architect in that sense, and if perhaps the problem, maybe a question of architecture is this format of length and kind of responsibility, and curatorial work, of course, carries some of that, but it's so temporary that it allows for maybe different things to happen. So I wonder if you could build us a little bit of a bridge to the role of the architect, and if maybe we should be rethinking formats a little bit more.
So thank you for that question, actually, and I think it directly deals with institutional settings, and I think I'm fortunate as a curator to be freelancing rather than being in a institution. So if you were at a very conservative national museum, I think you would be much more restricted as a curator for doing different things. And so I think for architects, I think the challenge is much more difficult because the practice of the professional practice obviously has extremely complex sort of institutional restrictions. And to do architecture as a experimental work, as a way of practicing change is extremely, extremely difficult. We all know that. And so that's why for me, for example, the Gwangju Folly project is so important, that it is an opportunity where you can actually build do architecture in the real world and be experimental at the same time. And so I don't think you can do it alone, that you sort of like create a setting where you can experiment with your own architecture. That, of course, even in curatorial work, in any kind of work, I think it doesn't happen. So the transformations have to be together, and I think society is changing where architects do have certain sort of opportunities where real experiment can actually happen. And of course, in more general practice, I hear a lot of architects say that in their normal office practice, if they can do just like 5% of new things, then they are happy. So I think at the individual level, I think you continue to search for settings where you can practice change, where you can experiment, and so you try to position yourself institutionally and with colleagues that can do. It's a very mundane, it's a very ordinary answer, but that's I think reality.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much for the talk. I think it was extremely inspiring, especially since there are a lot of us here who are kind of in our final years and we're trying to find a path in terms of what architecture means to us. And I feel like there's a lot of social pressure in a sense to establish what are you gonna do and how are you defining the profession that you're going into. And I feel like in the academic environment, we are taught a lot about knowledge, but when we come out of it, in a sense, we're missing the part of experience and actual expertise. And I feel like with a lot of us, we get this almost imposter syndrome about the things we actually know and how we're able to manifest that in the architecture field. So I thought it was very interesting when you mentioned doing an exhibition about Northern Korea architecture. How did you kind of navigate not knowing, and what kind of tips would you be giving us in how to approach our careers, since architecture is becoming so fluid and interacting with so many fields?
again, it's a very mundane answer, but you have to have good friends. You walk through conditions of ignorance through different collaborative relations. And so I think with curatorial work, of the obvious sort of challenge is always to get the right partners, to get the right artists, to get the right participating architects. And for that exhibition, for the Crow's Eye View exhibition, we maneuvered through this condition of ignorance through those who had experience in North Korea. So it was mostly Western because very few Koreans were able to go to North Korea at different points of the last half century. And so you sort of borrow the experience. It could be a photographic excursion by an Italian photographer. It could be a Korean who has a Canadian citizenship and somehow was able to go to Pyongyang and do research on the housing situation. And so you sort of create the right collaborative network and then move on. And again, this is not a new thing. It's part of architectural culture. You work with consultants, you work with different designers, staff, the client. And so architecture is fundamentally a collaborative work. And so that, I think, is changing, obviously. And for me, I wrote a small essay a couple of years back for Architectural Review. And I think the idea is not to be confined by what is institutionally defined as architecture or as design or as art or as curatorial work. And so I think what has been productive for me is to not mind whether this is an architectural exhibition or whether this is art or this is design. I think the disciplinary boundaries, actually it's more professional boundaries that condition what you do is becoming, a hindrance. Actually, it is a modern system that has to be disassembled. I think and reorganized. So the key is not to worry about what other people think about whether it's architecture or not, whether it's design or not. And so, there's a task, obviously, and you do it, and you worry whether it's architectural or not later on.
Thank you for the lecture, and I have a question about that curatoration. And it has become an era where information is known without interest. So, and it has become more difficult to maintain the positive view. Nevertheless, the professor's curatoration is about positive. So I wonder how we can maintain the attitude at this time. Yeah.
Maintain a positive attitude? Okay. So, positive attitude, I think, is energy, is to be able to do things and have the sense that it will effect change. And so I think it is to identify what are the issues and what is interesting and what is doable, and so but that is shifting, actually, that is changing. That's why the challenge is to, I think, for each individual to understand what can be done, actually. And there are a lot of things when you sort of engage in things that are going on in the world. You understand that actually that a lot of things are happening that are not connected or that people do not know or is not part of the mainstream. And so from my standpoint, for example, I'm sort of really getting into circular economy, issues, companies that are actually doing it. And so at one point, sometimes it feels very abstract, like we know the term, what it means, and it's, of course, a very clear idea of how we sort of go away from this sort of modern method of production and consumption and waste. And it's sort of scattered, but it's not abstract, that there are pockets and people and companies and individuals that are doing extremely interesting things that are very, very palpable, but not connected, because obviously circular economy is like 7-8% of the whole. So it has this sort of scattered thing, but there are very, very interesting streams that I think architects, young architects, students, or you know, lifelong achieved architects can enter into. So in my case, I did not just invite younger architects who you would assume that are more in tune with climate change issues, but actually those who of the older generation who knows anything about what's going on in the world understand that they have to change their ways of practicing. And so those who know that and have worked through that, actually their experience through the modern conditions actually helps them in sort of changing. Of course, it's not easy, but there are very specific things that can be done. So once you understand that, then I think whether you call it positive, because we do live in a sort of very pessimistic world. It's a very different kind of condition from when I grew up, and we thought that, you know, Korea would forever be develop and be better, but of course on the outside it seems so, but we all know that there are serious issues in this society itself that needs to be dealt with. And so I think it's not a matter of positive or negative, but to find the kind of internal energy where you know that this is something that you can do, and that it will be extremely actually fun. It has to be fun, I think. That's the point.
Thank you very much for your enjoyable and inspirational lectures. And it is really nice to look at how the individual one changing by changing circumstance in Korea. So I have one question is how does curators lead you to change as a critic or historian now or later on? Can you guess it? Or because I guess as a curator, maybe you have a kind of interaction between as a curator to as a historian, maybe critics. So those different types of expertise or professional maybe make interaction or relationship between as a good way or some different way. So I think I want to listen your opinion, some kind of exchange between different professions, or some in the future you might have a different kind of development or some relationship between those things.
I think this relates to the first question about the relation, how we can sort of think through architecture through sort of like the curatorial experience, particularly what I had gone through. And I think is that that curatorial work has a very specific institutional condition and challenge. Of course, it differs a bit from Korea or with the UK, but like architecture, curatorial work happens in very conservative institutional settings, and so one of the specific challenge I think for curatorial work within museums, art museums, is that there continues to be this division between art, architecture, design, and despite of all the things that are happening, despite all the talk about fusion and interdisciplinary and whatever, I think this this very unrealistic distinction between art, architecture, design, craft continues on. And in everyday life, in the everyday practice of museums, you still see sort of things going on that would have happened in the 19th century. And so that is, I think, the key challenge to curatorial work in Korea, but also in most, I think, established museums. These departments, these ideas of what art is, what architecture is, and how, when you do an exhibition on architecture, this has to happen in art, and of course, there are forces, large forces that define that. And so it's not easy institutionally to break through these categories. But that is what I try to do. When even within conservative established national museums, the challenge always is to transform that institutions. And the first thing is to break through those divisions. So I can give you many examples, things that are going on now, but we fight through that actually at this very moment.
Thank you very much, Hyungmin. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this enlightening experience actually. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.